Welcome to the Intrinsically Ordered podcast. Today, I am joined by the one and only Evan, your favorite Catholic YouTuber.
This last weekend, we had another crazy adventure where Mr. Cade here went to every major Christian denomination's church. So we went to a Messianic Jewish church, a Catholic church, Pentecostal church, a Baptist church, an Orthodox church, an Anglican church,
Presbyterian
church, a Mormon. No.
Controversial. We got 7. This weekend I went to church 7 times in one weekend,
And he converted.
Close. You'll have to watch the video to see like all of the different types of churches and filming inside and some of my immediate thoughts. But I figured we'd do a sort of post-breakdown deep dive without having to shorten things for YouTube. So we're going to talk a little bit about churches. Evan's going to try to make me make sense because I say things in convoluted ways. So let's dive in. Where do we even start? Elevator pitch of your background, and then I'll give the audience, in case they're seeing me for the first time, my own shtick.
Yeah, that's a good way to start. So I grew up non-denominational Christianity, going to Calvary Chapel. And ever since I was a kid, I've always been interested in the truth. You know, what is the best way to live life? What is the meaning of life? And then by extension, when I was a sophomore in high school, I started investigating different denominations because I was like, what the heck? You walk down the street, you got an Anglican, a Baptist, Jehovah's Witness, a Catholic, an Orthodox, and you even got other religions, you know, Hindu temple, Jewish synagogue, and I was like, what is happening? So I did some research of different denominations, and one denomination in particular kept on coming back to me, which was Catholicism, and it's claimed to be the one true church, the one started by Jesus Christ. And growing up, Calvary Chapel, non-denominational church, where I never even learned anything of anybody that existed more than 60 years ago, this idea honestly really captivated me. And also simultaneously, I felt that I was trying my best to be strong in my faith at Calvary Chapel, and yet it also felt shallow. And so then I started going to Catholic Mass. At first, I thought it was weird, but then I sort of fell in love with it. My questions were answered. And one thing about my background is that I had every incentive to stay non-denominational Christian. I mean, my family was very anti-Catholic. Even when I was eventually baptized and confirmed, my mom didn't go there. Like, she canceled 5 minutes before it happened. My dad was there, and he left after 5 minutes because he said it was confusing and weird things were happening. And that's kind of the story of my conversion, my parents, and over time they've, gradually opened up to Catholicism. And I think that my channel is basically a logical culmination of just like how I felt ever since I was a kid. Like, how can people have these different beliefs? How can there be these different religions? People will live and die for these beliefs. And it's like, why do you believe this? What about it captivates you? And so then Cade got a little taste of that by going to all these churches.
Yeah, to tell the audience about my own background, I grew up sort of normal suburban Catholic. We went to Mass almost every weekend, but certainly weren't like deep into church politics or going to adoration all the time. And then into middle school and into high school, I started taking my faith super seriously. I was making friends, was learning theology, got big into apologetics, into philosophy, into theology, and then like deep down the rabbit hole, started attending pretty much exclusively the Latin Mass. And like my goal in life was to become a Catholic priest. That's where I thought my life was going. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I went back through and sort of re-looked at all of my beliefs and wanted sort of the weight of my belief to match up to the weight of my evidence, or of the evidence, I should say, and found that though there is apologetics for the Catholic faith, it didn't quite get me to 100% confidence, and so left 2.5, almost 3 years ago, and then like a year and a half ago, started doing content, and then I had reached out to you if we wanted to collab.
Mm-hmm.
What made you want to accept my DM and then actually come up with the concept for the video is on you.
Great question. Well, first things is that you filmed a video with my good friend, Mr. Iron Inquisitor.
Shout out Randall.
And Randall spoke very highly of you. And of course, I saw the video, and so I was like, dude, you got to get this guy. This guy's the top boss of atheism. Bro's debated Michael Knowles, Jordan Peterson.
Top boss is a bit of a stretch, but.
And, I reached out to you with the idea because it's kind of a play on my two biggest formats, going to every Christian denomination church and then taking a non-believer to church for the first time. And I was like, bada bing, bada boom. And an excuse to go to Denver? Sign me up.
Can't beat the mountains.
Mm-hmm. Can't beat the mountains.
And so we were putting this on the calendar. What did you expect going into it, having seen clips of my own stuff? Yeah, what did you expect out of this weekend, and how did you choose churches?
So one thing that was very surprising is that when I'm with atheists or Muslims, sometimes they'll say very mean things about Christians, and you never said anything that was super off-putting. Yeah. I remember I was even like, dude, like, you're not giving me the clips. Like, there's no clips for me to get, because you genuinely do have a care and respect for Christians, which I've observed. It's just, of course, you have differences with them. And so I admired learning that about you over the weekend.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think it wasn't until close to the last church that you really started cracking the code on how I see religion. And there was a bunch of takes that probably won't make it to the final edit of me going on rants on different things, because I've spent now 23, the past 10 years deep into Catholicism, thinking through religion at every angle. And so I even find it oftentimes difficult to communicate 10 years of like nerding out on technical theology into some sort of shorter format. So your editor will have a ton of fun dealing with those.
Yeah. And I guess to kind of explain how I saw your position as, and then you can fill in the gaps. I saw it as the existence of God is in of itself very unlikely. But if you were to believe in God, the next question would be, which story of God would you like most? Would it be a deist, sort of like God exists but is not involved with creation? Would it be sort of akin to like the Hindus' idea of like Dharma and our purpose and multiple gods and deities and paths of God? Or is it the Christian, God sent his only begotten son to die for us and sacrifice for us? And so that's what I interpreted your position as. And then specifically, if it is Christianity, which denomination? Because they all have different things that they emphasize. Like, for example, a Pentecostal church might emphasize more emotion, whereas a Orthodox church might more emphasize the reverence of the liturgy and the Eucharist, and a non-denominational church might emphasize the coffee. I love non-denominational churches, but you guys always have coffee.
and the fog machine.
And the fog machine. Yeah.
Yeah, I find religion to be a fascinating phenomenon to investigate. And whenever I talk to people, it seems like religion, most of the time, is never a purely sort of factual claim like a textbook, right? Like if I'm answering technical questions on like the camera that we're using right now, there's sort of clear-cut answers. We can all get to the same answers, and we can investigate. And there are these facts about it, but I don't live my life according to like what is the resolution of a particular camera. Whereas with religion, when people talk about the experience and the beauty and the transformation in their lives, the facts might be a starting point, but they're never the whole picture. It's not sort of a reading some Civil War novel and debating over like an intricacy. It's like this is the thing that shapes people's worldviews and their narratives. Yeah. And so that's what I found fascinating going back to the church for the first time in a while, seeing 7 different variations of that, that though they might all fit under the Christian label, I think what they are in their essence were so fundamentally different that engaging them on their own terms and the stories and how they look at the world are so radically different and compelling in different ways. But didn't get me quite closer to converting.
Hey, we God planted a seed. God planted a seed, and maybe that seed just dies. So there's a seed.
Maybe this is on the rocks, or maybe it was in fertile soil. We do not know where the seeds have been sown.
But yeah, it is really interesting. I think that 5 years ago, before I converted, I would have been like, oh, there's a bunch of Christians, and oh, they have these differences, but not really thinking too deeply. And then when I first became intellectually converted to Catholicism, I was like, Catholicism is right. Non-denominational churches are all screwed up. It's all crazy. It's all wackadoodle. There's 45,000 denominations of Christianity. And then now I'm sort of like, I see good fruits and all these different denominations. They're incredibly beautiful. I've literally talked to a pastor of literally every single major Christian denomination. Like, I've asked them some of the toughest questions. I think that over time, I've just sort of been like, I've had a hearty respect for different denominations and different expressions. But also, simultaneously, while I do love and adore all denominations, I've also found a greater appreciation of Catholicism because, there's just a lot of differences, but I take pride in knowing that Catholicism is united and it's kept steadfast to these moral teachings and as a system of authority, and Vatican City is so beautiful. And sure, Catholicism has problems, and I listen, I'd be the best guy at telling you all those problems, but I take the problems of Catholicism versus other denominations, And
so let's hop into these churches. Evan's going to intro sort of the churches that we went through, give his own thoughts, and then I'll give my own thoughts, and he can grill me, he can push me.
Yeah,
we'll
for
see
sure.
where we end up.
For sure. Yeah, so the first church we went to was a Messianic Jewish church. I first went to a church like this in Dallas, and so in a nutshell, Messianic Jews, or this sect of Christianity, they are Jews and Gentiles who alike believe Jesus is the Messiah. So typically Jews reject Jesus as the Messiah because they don't believe he fulfilled the Old Testament prophecies perfectly. Whereas Messianic Jews are a movement that developed in the 60s and 70s of Jews and Gentiles alike who do recognize Jesus as Messiah. And then they have, various Hebrew prayers. And then depending on which church it is, it might have more Jews, it might have more Gentiles. The one I was at in Dallas, they had a bar mitzvah in the middle of it. They brought out the Torah and everyone's kissing it. They had only Arabic music. They had a rabbi. I don't know if they would call him a rabbi, but he looked more like a rabbi from Judaism. Yeah. Whereas the one we went to, 2 days ago, it kind of just felt like Calvary Chapel, both like Hebrew prayers. So what were your thoughts on it?
I think it was fascinating to see a side of Christianity that I've never seen. Like, I had to Wikipedia, like, what is Messianic Judaism the night before. In showing up, I could tell it was such a recent thing. Like, it came around in the 60s and 70s. It's very, like, evangelical coded, but they want to dive more into the history of it all. And they're in a sort of non-denominational church that they rent because they did this on a Saturday. They had praise and worship style music, the projector, all of that. A whole lot more Hebrew mixed in. I can appreciate the history. It did feel a little tacky in a certain sense to have these people trying to reinvent Jewish history in a certain sense. But I found the message, which that sermon must have been like an hour long, a fascinating angle because it wasn't about heaven. It wasn't about the end times. It also wasn't like some sermon about how Jesus says XYZ about politics. It was like God is powerful, God is sovereign, but he's simple and like has this plan for us. So accept the world as it is to become holy where we are. It was a very sort of like humble and mature message that I found from them. And this, I also don't know Hebrew. So maybe they smuggled in some other meaning. But that's my general impression. It was very Eastern or Buddhist in a certain sense of like accepting everything and getting rid of like fighting the world as it is. And so I found them quite peaceful and quite an interesting group, even if a little tacky.
Yeah, no. I mean, for me, I just sort of saw it as, we've got these prayers and then we've got this long-winded Bible study. I guess, yeah. One thing, what was interesting is that they didn't celebrate communion whatsoever. Yeah.
And then the second one we went to, was it the Catholic Church right away? Or did we have a
Yes,
new
we
one?
went
Okay.
to a Catholic church.
So we went to one downtown. And I remember looking at the maps and I was like, I've driven through downtown and I haven't seen a church. And so a block away, I was like, either I'm blind or this thing's like camouflage. And sure enough, it was sort of the color of the building behind it, just tucked into the middle of downtown. I didn't even know it was there. But it was a phenomenally beautiful and ornate and very tall church, a very old one. And we also sat in the front row. So a lot of it was looking up towards the altar, towards the ceiling, and the pulpit was one of those like 10, 15 foot off the ground ones. So that was our second mass. What did you think? Or our second service, I should say. What did you think of that?
I loved it. It was super reverent and it was really beautiful. I felt that the architecture really elevated it. And, taking the Eucharist was awesome. I'm curious to know your thoughts, ex-Catholic, going to a Catholic church.
It was incredibly eschatological, which is like a fancy word for like the end times, sort of the world to come. Like the first service we went to was very like here and now and accepting, and God has a plan and he is humble talking to you now. Catholicism, and even talking about the Mass, is like a foretaste of heaven, the wedding feast of the Lamb, the representation of Christ's sacrifice, and even the sermon and the liturgy was much more about like ushering in and focusing on the world to come. I mean, Catholics famous for the four last things of dying and then judgment and then purgatory and heaven and hell. It was very much, it was less about like the here and now. It was much more about seeing the next life, which I think as I've gotten further from seeing certainty in the next life, the idea of losing focus on this life to focus on the next one becomes less and less compelling, even if the aesthetics are very ornate and so much beautiful art there. It was, I think, the least compelling. I was also the most familiar with it and could have given a 2-hour lecture on the parts of the Mass. So.
Yeah. No, I think that is a fair way to describe the distinction. And I would say all of Christianity is basically, falling on those two scales, focused more on the present and then focused more on heaven. And it's not to say, of course, that like the Messianic Jewish synagogue or church wasn't about that. They just didn't emphasize it as much in their presentation of everything. And I guess that is an interesting perspective, because if heaven isn't true, then it's sort of like, what the heck is the point of it all, But also, I would argue that it's only through like a great love of heaven that we can like truly do incredible things for the present. It's like something about like, just loving what's to come just helps in the here and now. I don't know. Interesting.
There's certainly more healthy balances. I found, at least in my own experience of like Latin Mass Catholicism, that life quickly becomes a sort of waiting room to just die, to finally make it to heaven and do things there. And this life is much more about suffering. And it's also so varied across Catholic churches. Or you have ones that are much more about the here and now. You have ones that are much more about God's kingdom here and establishing social justice. And then there's the balance. Then there's also the like, everything's just about death and dying, and hopefully you're not burning alive.
Yeah.
And you've prayed enough in purgatory, and we gotta like get our relatives out of there. So it's always a fascinating balance between all of them. Because then our third church then was the Pentecostal prayer service, which wasn't their main service, but it was them gathering the night before. They brought prayer intentions and went immediately to speaking in tongues. And like their angle, like they thought about heaven, and they thought about the present, but it was much more about like in the coming days and weeks, we have the power of prayer. We have the gifts of the Holy Spirit. We are action oriented, like a prayer sweatshop in a certain sense. And like, they're like looking a few weeks ahead, like we can get this stuff done. Which I thought was also then like a third and very unique angle to the churches that we've seen.
Yeah. No, I guess it's very interesting hearing your perspectives on these churches. That is certainly one aspect of Pentecostalism. But then also, I would add one thing about all of this. I don't know how the heck this fits into what you're describing, but like it seems to me, from my perspective, that like evangelicals and Pentecostals are like, they are so focused on like the future and like prophecies. You know, like for example, today was supposed to be the rapture,
And we're just bad, you and I, not going to heaven, or I think some of them are still around on the 23rd. I would dare to think. I haven't checked.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because I remember growing up, and that was because I grew up in a non-denominational household, and prophecies and like the rapture was like always on our minds.
Yeah.
You know, like Left Behind and all this pop culture, and it's like, when are you gonna get raptured? It's so interesting. Whereas Catholics, I've like never heard of a Catholic. Obviously, there are some prophecies that are exceptions to this, but I've never really heard Catholics that worried about prophecy and whatnot.
Yeah, it's a very different view of the end times, where the sort of evangelical and Pentecostal sides do tend to focus on like, we know like based off of these events in an unnamed foreign nation and these things that are happening here, like we've deciphered like this is the end time, and then we're gonna have the rapture, and then we're gonna have 7 books of the Left Behind series. Nicolas Cage is gonna be on an airplane. Like it's the focus there. Catholics don't have as much specific prophecy. Like you get people that are deep into like Fatima and the prophecies there, but sort of, I mean, also in the Catholic view, it's like when Christ comes back, like we don't know as much, and it's just about heaven, versus evangelicals have this like, we're gonna have like the tribulation. There's gonna be like, they're trying to figure that out. Catholics are just like, where are we gonna end up, and who has like a state of grace, and how much penance are we gonna have to do in case we do still have this attachment to sin. Like it's focusing on the end, but the story that's told there are 2 very different ones.
Yeah, it is. I wonder how much of that is sort of like an overcorrection from how their services are. It's kind of like, you know, Catholics, that aspect might feel fulfilled during the Mass.
Yeah.
Evangelicals, since they're, you know, it's just a service. You know, some churches are literally just music and a Bible study. You know, they might feel like to compensate for that, they might have this. Kind of interesting to think about.
I mean, Catholics have a much more elaborate view and theology of what heaven entails. And the idea of the Mass is like, this is the ripping of the veil between heaven and earth. And like, this is heaven on earth. And so the liturgy and the prayers and the vestments and the architecture and everything sort of about beauty and transcendence as a way to see this foretaste of heaven, versus evangelicals are just sort of like, well, we're going to focus on the end times because heaven's just like, did you get in or not? Catholics have a lot more sort of storytelling about what heaven might look like. Versus evangelicals, like, they got to have, I shouldn't say all evangelicals, but the people that are focused on the end times, their elaborate theology is numbers and who's the mark of the beast and what relates to what in world affairs, which is always sort of mildly entertaining and also disturbing to see people like throwing their lives away or kids being scared. And then moving into day 2 on Sunday, we started out at an Orthodox church, which was a house turned school, and then this congregation bought it like a decade ago. And so it's a house church. They'd like cleared walls. They have their icons and walls and all of that jazz in this like very large room. It was a simple church, but it felt very organic and home-like and family-like. What did you think of it?
You know, I really enjoyed it. I really like the small congregations. I find that, you know, it's just no good to walk into a church and be nameless.
Yeah.
Nobody knows who you are. I thought the liturgy was really awesome. It was also very Western, like inspired. You know, for example, some Orthodox churches, they don't have pews, and so you stand the whole time. This one had seats. And then, afterwards, you know, you had a potluck, and literally, like, I felt like we knew everyone there, you know, asking them all their stories. I have a deep respect for Orthodoxy. And what were your thoughts?
I was glad that we didn't go down the toxic Orthodox rabbit hole, because and I told Evan this, that I've seen people convert to Orthodoxy for 2 very different reasons. There's people that sort of want to get away from the legalism and perceived toxicity of, let's say, the Roman Rite, And then there's also people that don't want any guardrails on what they can say online and get much more uncharitable, mean even, and then like find the Orthodox Church in that sort of rabbit hole. It was nice seeing this congregation, which certainly wasn't liberal by any persuasion, but they seem to have this mature view of faith where, the pre-sermon was about how, yes, Christ calls us to carry our cross, but his burden is light, and it like calls us to these great heights, but it's not this like infinite sufferfest to post on your Instagram stories, in space, or specifically Instagram stories. But it was like, yes, following Christ is difficult, but he's giving us this grace, and they take their liturgy seriously. But you had kids wrestling, you had people doing different things, some people that didn't even have shoes on, like it was the reverence of the liturgy without like, do you have your hands crossed in like the perfect right way? And like, do you have the right posture? And like, did you perfectly memorize when you actually kneel during like whatever part of the prayers at the end of Mass? Like it seemed well balanced in a certain sense.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that there are some excesses of the Catholic Church where people can be, I think, a little bit like stuffy and snobbish about how worship should be done. Like, if it's not this specific music, with this specific clothing you're wearing, with this specific thing they do at the Mass, you're heretical. And some people will actually legitimately believe that. It's not all Catholics, of course, not all trad Catholics, but some people legitimately believe that. And I think that, Christ would judge us more upon our intentions rather than necessarily like, if a new believer walks in the church and they're wearing a hat, like someone like, hey, you can't wear a hat. You got to get out of here. he always took off his hat whenever he walked in these churches. I'll say that. And so, yeah, I think Orthodoxy has that aspect really down.
And their sort of angle and how they talked was like, we are here in this life and sort of this groan towards heaven, this reaching up towards the heavens and God reaching down. So it's focused on sort of the life to come in the way that the Catholic Mass was, but it felt more cognizant of this life, which there's going to be people that say that's a good thing and people that say that's a bad thing. And then from there, we went to the popular non-denominational church in Denver, Red Rocks, which is like the name around town that I've heard for forever, is the conservative leaning, but easy to attend and did not completely off-putting megachurch with a number of different campuses, thousands and thousands and thousands of participants. And that was our second for the day. What did you make of that?
Dude, honestly, I really loved it. People have this conception of Catholics hating non-denominational churches, and there are Catholics who don't like how they worship. But I love non-denominational churches. I think that it's really beautiful. Love the worship music, especially this. It felt like it really was meditative. Yeah. So I love that. The talk by the pastor, I didn't like that it was kind of like televised. So it was like
they just dropped down the projector, and then everybody in the satellite campus was just watching. I mean, their AV audio-visual stuff was top notch. Their production value was top notch. Like, it wasn't a terrible projector, but it was weird to sort of be watching a YouTube video. I mean, it was live, but a live YouTube video with you and your few hundred closest friends.
Yeah, it's kind of like this principle of what I said earlier about smaller congregations. It's like, if you can't even shake the pastor's hand after church, there's something deeply wrong with that church in some aspects. And but overall, I thought it was really enjoyable. And yeah, what were your thoughts?
Had some rockin' music. I think it was one of the least compelling to me, just because I'd seen it before. I mean, there's so much still in my brain stuck from Catholicism hating on non-denominational churches. It was, I get the appeal, and there's so many people that like that they can go to church and it doesn't feel like they have to memorize this esoteric liturgy or be stuck in a different world. Like, it felt like our culture, but sort of elevated. And so that's something that I think they do well, but because it was close to our culture and it wasn't super compelling, it sort of fell flat in my own book. And I also knew enough about it and found involving some of the topics in the sermon. I was like, it's sort of, the other churches sort of had this angle or like a takeaway from their preaching. This one felt like there was less of a takeaway and more like a scan a QR code, which is certainly something that our churches want to encourage community. But there didn't feel to be as much of a lesson or like this experience apart from the worship music and being able to just raise your hands and sort of lose yourself in this repeating of these different lyrics and thinking of God. I didn't have a terrible time, but I think that one ended up closer to the bottom of my list of places.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying. There's definitely an aspect of megachurches where it's sort of like an economic, like utilitarian, like let's get people in, let's get people out, let's get as many people as possible. And I think sometimes about that mindset, which I do think to a certain degree some churches need to adopt. Obviously, we need to grow, we need to build the churches, but also simultaneously, Jesus said, I would leave the 99 to save the one.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think that in Christianity we can think more, but God judges the heart and more about the quality of an individual and the engagement that they have with each other. And so I just think it's really interesting to think about,
And then our final one was Nova after that. Am I forgetting one?
No, we went to an Anglican Evensong.
How could I forget about that? Yeah, we went to downtown Denver. I'd heard of the cathedral and know of people who go there, but had never actually been or seen the inside. So we went to their evening song, which is part of the prayer of the church, has hours, and there's a lot of every day of the year has these different prayers throughout different times of the day. And so this was their Saturday night, like people would normally just be praying this at home, but they brought in the choir. And I think they had the best music and the most beautiful church. Like I've been to the Denver Catholic Cathedral. Normally Catholic cathedrals are knock your socks off. I think this Anglican cathedral though was
takes the cake.
More beautiful and easy on the eyes and ornate. And their choir just knocked it out of the park. Even though it wasn't official liturgy, or they didn't have preaching for me to do my analysis of like what's sort of the story that's being told here. But it was just beautiful to go there and attend. Huge stained glass and a beautiful choir.
Well, I think even inherently the fact that there was this prayer service and it felt so angelic, I think speaks to Anglicanism. And I really love the aesthetics of Anglicanism. I love the music. A lot of like the most popular Christian hymns are from Anglicanism. And it's kind of funny because I was talking to the Anglican priest and he basically said like you walk into an Anglican church, you don't know what you're going to get. Like I was in England and like they have like Pentecostal Anglican churches. Like it's basically like there are a lot of different types of Anglican churches out there. And it's really interesting to see that. And specifically the music here was just so awesome. I think that, at the end of the day, like music can give us a taste of heaven. And like this choir and this, like literally like people describe it as angelic and it sounds like a cliche, but it captures that feeling, this feeling of God. And it's just so beautiful. Like this was the one out of all of them that had like the most powerful spiritual experience. It was just so moving,
And then our last and final church was Nova Church, which is a Presbyterian church plant that sort of looks like an average non-denominational leaning or evangelical church plant. It's a very small congregation. They had great music. They did communion. And what I found most compelling about that one is that the sermon was essentially looking at like what is the story that you want to belong to, looking at Christianity through a narrative lens. My sort of assumption from being there is that they're not quite as heavy on the systematic theology and like these sort of like technical distinctions between all of the denominations, and much more about this sort of story that they have of Christ, independent of these rigid or mandatory beliefs. And I think they asked the right question of like, what story do you want to belong to? Because we all belong to some story in our lives. And so they were sort of speaking my language, and I found that one the most compelling. But I think anybody who like really has their theology hat on theology hat on would have been like, oh, like they're not preaching about like XYZ sort of mandatory belief or the Apostles' Creed, like all of these things. And I think that's why this one I found most compelling.
Yeah. Yeah, well, as quote unquote stripped down as it was, there were some aspects of it that, they would have prayers that we would recite. They took communion, one of 3 churches that we went to. Anglican, they would have had communion, but we went to a prayer service. So it's kind of like they took the what the early church would have done, and they just sort of like stripped it down to its basics. Like you got worship, you got prayers, you got talk, and you got communion. And I think that's one thing that I think all Christians, regardless of denomination, really need to think about is stressing the importance of communion. Because regardless of whether you believe it's the literal body of Christ or whether you believe it's a symbol, at the end of the day, what is it? It is participating in Christ's sacrifice and like remembering what happened. And it's sort of like, that is the point of Christianity.
Yeah.
That's the whole point. That's what separates us from other religions, is that God sacrificed himself for us. Like, and there was no other person that was also sacrificed, it was him,
And they also felt very, very genuine in their own experience of Christianity, because I've talked to some people who are telling me about their religion or telling me to convert, and it seems like their religion is sort of an intellectual exercise, or like arguing to like some random political point, or they feel so certain about their own experience of the world that they sort of like steamroll somebody else's experience. This group, I could tell they prayed hard. They really cared about the gospel and loved Jesus, but without the sort of bombastic nature that the non-denominational church was trying to overhype, or the deconstruction angle that some more progressive Christian denominations can have. It felt very grounded and mature in what they were trying to do.
I think another way to, and we've been talking about this nonstop, is it felt genuine. Some of these churches felt less or more genuine, but Nova is one definitely in the genuine side. And it's hard to understand why exactly. Maybe it was a smaller congregation. Maybe it was just the down-to-earth simplicity of it all. But I think at the end of the day, I feel like you can sense a soul in these churches. And it's sort of like, I think it really does come down to like, what was the intention? Like, why was Nova Church started? It's like a Presbyterian plant. They're starting it in the heart of the city. On their website, it says they're trying to, go back to the simplicity of the gospel and early Christians. And it's sort of like when you think about the intentions of why, there's something beautiful about that,
I found after going to all 7 of these churches, my own sort of takeaway of being back in that many church services in one weekend, it was interesting seeing the parts of these different churches that were sort of blasts from the past, or felt like, oh, I remember experiencing or thinking through these different things. I super enjoyed getting to hear everybody's story. Like we talked to people after most of the services, and to hear how people's lives have been made better by these different congregations was great to hear. I didn't personally find that, like I found that I can appreciate somebody's personal story and love it for them, and still not be compelled by these sort of
for sure
crazy like conversion stories and how much better their life is. The people or the sermons that tried to take a sort of, I'm going to argue for Christianity, like I've looked so far into these issues that it's like I don't know if there's ever going to be any new angle. And so there was nothing that really reached through. I think the closest thing was Nova Church, because they had a very different way of looking at religion. I don't know if I was compelled by the other 6 as sort of different variations and compelling variations of Christianity, but they all felt so different, and they were doing such a different thing that, at least from an outside perspective, they almost feel like different religions in a certain sense of how different of an angle. And from my angle, like different religions isn't a bad thing, but they seem to be doing such different things in compelling and very different ways. But I don't know if any of them had the potential to convince me of the facts of Christianity or to see the sales pitch of the benefits of Christianity in some new life.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's interesting to hear your perspective, because I personally have felt what I would describe as the Holy Spirit
Yeah.
at all these churches to varying degrees. And I think that even if I have these logical arguments for Christianity, but even if I didn't, those would convince me of Christianity. And so I guess it's just interesting to hear from an atheist perspective, kind of like how you don't have that, or you like rationalize it away as like, psychological experience,
Well, I think it's that experience of peace and joy and transcendence is really what I see religions as. And so when I've talked to people from other religions that talk about that same experience, or people who are outside of religion that describe a similar type of phenomena, it's in a certain sense me not converting over these compelling stories isn't that I'm discounting them. It's that I'm seeing that in so many other places and take other people's experiences so seriously that I don't know how I could rejoin a religion and have to discount or dismiss or intellectualize away other people's experiences of this transcendence in other phenomena, or in other locations, other religions, non-traditional spiritualities, that I think at the core that's what religion is. And certainly in those churches when I'm meditating or getting to experience a sense of peace, of calm, of community, of all of these things. But I don't think that is seeing goodness in these things would ever get me to go like, oh, I felt the Holy Spirit of this phenomena, and ergo I'm going to like believe in the Trinity. Like, and that's what I think Nova Church was so compelling, because it was like, this is the story. This is what we're doing. This is what is giving life to our lives. And there wasn't so insert a political point, or so insert something about the hypostatic union, or sign up for this particular laundry list of beliefs. Like that's where a church loses me as soon as it moves from experience to a belief statement.
Well, I think if this video does well, we got to run it back and have atheists go to every religion's place of worship.
Now that is much more my speed. I get to spend a lot of time with friends in the mountains who are parts of different religions and have borrowed ideas and concepts from the Buddhists and from the pagans and from the Christians and from the non-religious. So I guess we do have to do a part 2 and see if I go join some other religion.
Yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts?
Do I have any closing thoughts? I think when I was looking at leaving religion, I thought that like to take the big questions of life and to take spirituality and meaning and purpose and history seriously, I was going to have to stay. But what I found since leaving religion, like those big questions of life, where are we from? What is meaningful? What is morality? What happened some 2,000 years ago? It was by taking those questions seriously and honestly that sort of moved me out of just Catholicism. And I think that the biggest misconception about atheism is like, I don't think about not believing in God in my day-to-day life. Like it's not, in a weird way, atheism certainly describes my position, but it's not part of my identity. It's not something that I live by. It doesn't offer a worldview. And so I think some people get it mixed up where it's like, oh, what am I going to do if I leave Christianity and I have to believe in atheism? It's like, no, this is sort of like a negation of things. And then you begin a journey of figuring out those big questions in an honest one. And I only really ever consider myself atheist in response to somebody trying to get me to believe something. And there's so much more beauty to life out there than just Christianity or pessimism and nihilism. I think that was sort of my biggest misconception, leaving from Catholic apologetics card-carrying member to leaving now 2.5 years later.
Fascinating.
Thank you so much for being on. Where can people watch this main video and watch some of your other content?
Just my name, Evan August, EVAN, R and then August. You can look up, I went to every Christian denomination church, it'll pop up. Yeah.
Hit them up. There are so many great creators out there in the religion world. And Evan is certainly one of them without the there's some influencers out there that you watch their channel and video 4, you go like, oh. I think with Evan's videos, you keep watching them and they're fun to watch. You get to hear about the world, and there's not some hidden thing like 7 videos in that's some abhorrent take or toxicity. So
I appreciate that a lot.
I've appreciated listening to your work, and it looks like there might be a part 2.